Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. It is insane to think that next week will be 2025. I think this year went by so fast, and you know, there were so many great things that happened this year. My sister got married, some of my other friends got married, some of my friends got engaged, and I read 100 books. We have different priorities, but they're my priorities nonetheless. So it is right now December 18th, and as of today I've read 99 books, and I believe my average rating for this year so far has been a 3.7. So far a pretty decent year, and today we're going to be talking about my top 24 books from 2024. 24 is a large number. While I did read a lot of great books, I'm not gonna lie, towards the end of this list I was kind of struggling to come up with some ideas. I will say this list is not in numerical order. I looked through my yearly reads and picked my favorites. And yeah, I didn't sort them. It's not least to favorite. It's just, we're just gonna talk about books today. Without further ado, let's get straight into it. Now, after I actually made my little list I have today, I finished a book that should be on this list, but it's not. So I wanna talk about it first. It is what my last video was about. I did a reading vlog for the book Manacled. Manacled is an Manacled is an AO3 fanfic. It is a Draco x Hermione fanfic. In that world, Voldemort ends up winning the war, Harry Potter dies, and Hermione is basically held captive as a slave for her body to repopulate the wizarding population. It is enemies to lovers, and it's just genuinely, I think, one of the most beautiful, well thought out books that I've ever read. The author is actually going to be re-releasing it. It's going to be called Alchemized, and I believe that book does come out in 2025. So I'm very excited to read how she traditionally publishes it. But yeah, I just finished that book. It has such a special place in my heart. It's such a long book, but I want to reread it. Like, genuinely, it was so good. I think it was 2 years ago, or maybe a year and a half ago, I read the Caraval series, and I absolutely loved those books. But Caraval is a YA fantasy series, and so this year, actually just pretty recently, I read Phantasma. Phantasma is sort of this adult take on the Caraval story. Phantasma is the actual name of the game. You follow our main character, who, it's two sisters, but one of them is the main character. She enters the game Phantasma to try and find her sister and save her sister. She ends up finding love in the game, but the whole thing is that love is like the most dangerous thing and that you shouldn't find love in the game. It is not the sort of like fantasy, insanely well thought out, it's gonna make you feel smart if you're reading it, but it's just a good time book. You don't want to put it down. There is a little bit of smut if you care about that, especially during like this time of year. A snowstorm in the dark next to a Christmas tree, just the perfect vibe and perfect atmosphere to read that book. But yeah, loved Phantasma. The next book is also a book that I read pretty recently, and when I read this book, I knew, like, out of every book on this list, this is genuinely probably my top favorite book that I read in 2024, and that is Fahrenheit 451. Fahrenheit 451 is a classic story about a sort of dystopian futuristic world where books are seen as propaganda, seen as something dangerous. So in this world, firefighters, instead of fighting fire, they're actually lighting books on fire and getting rid of any sort of text. Anyone who collects books or even talks about them is kind of seen as dangerous. It is a book that talks heavily about censorship and, you know, questioning government controls and things like that. I thought it was brilliant, and I'm not someone who loves reading classics, but I had such a great time reading that story. If you've thought about picking it up, I would recommend it, especially like if you're in the mood to read it. I think that's really when you're going to enjoy it the most. I understand when we don't like the books that we were recommended in English class, but genuinely they're amazing works of literature. So especially going into 2025, if you're going to pick up any book, please pick up that book. It has some really important messages. This next book is actually a book that I read / listened to in the beginning of the year. If you love the movie How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, it's genuinely my favorite rom-com. I actually have the physical copy of the DVD because I love it that much, but I read / listened to the rom-com by Devin Daniels. This book is literally How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, but in audio book form. I listened to the book on Spotify audiobook. This book book is just so amazing. It's very cliche. It's like an easy palate cleanser read, but I genuinely like never hear anyone talk about it. Such a fast-paced book. Loved it. Again, would recommend. All of these books in today's video, I would recommend. This next book I read, and I actually do think that some people are pretty like hit or miss for this story. This is a thriller, and it is The Last Word by Taylor Adams. This is a book about a reader who leaves a 1-star like negative review about a book that they just finished, and then she ends up, I think she's house sitting if I'm remembering correctly, or I think she's just like home alone. The author ends up stalking her and tries to kill her. This was one of those books that like I could not put down. I was genuinely shocked by it. I thought it was so great. I've not read any other Taylor Adams thrillers or mysteries, so if there are any other books by this author that you would recommend, let me know. This next book I definitely now have mixed opinions on, except it would feel like an injustice to the story and what it did for me to not mention it in today's video. So this book is Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, I've learned some things about Taylor Jenkins Reid as an author. That's kind of why I feel iffy about even mentioning this book. But if you don't know, Carrie Soto is Back is about a like pro tennis player, the GOAT of her time and of the league. She broke a record that is about to be broken again, so she decides to come out of retirement to prove that she is still the best. The reason I'm even mentioning this book and reading this is because I actually played tennis growing up. I had such a love for tennis, but I was bullied in high school. Through that, I ended up having like really bitter feelings towards tennis. I had to quit it. I don't know. It just brought up a lot of bad memories from my childhood anytime I thought about it. And after reading this book, it reignited my love for tennis. Literally, I have a ton of tennis balls and I restrung my racket. I go out to play tennis all the time now. I watch tennis, love Ben Shelton, love Coco Gauff. So, well, I wouldn't directly recommend the book to read it. If you're gonna read it, you could probably find it at Goodwill. That way you're not directly supporting the author, but it would feel like an injustice to this year and that bit of growth that I had in myself after reading that book to not mention it. So Carrie Soto is Back was genuinely such like a turning point of this year for me, and it felt like I healed a little part of like teenage me after reading that book. The next book that I want to talk about is actually a trilogy. I totally forgot that I did this in the beginning of the year. Like this year has felt like it's been 1,000 years in one. In the beginning of the year, I actually did a reread of the Hunger Games trilogy. I love my physical copies of those books because I annotated the out of my copies. Obviously, you all know what the Hunger Games is about, but especially in today's day and age, I bet you did not know the Hunger Games is actually on the banned book list. Like, that's crazy. I read it for more so childhood nostalgia. I've really been wanting to reread some of the books that I read when I was younger, going to the library, and that was kind of what I started off with. Honestly, I haven't really read many more. Maybe in 2025, I'll have to pick up some. I really want to reread the Maze Runner series. I loved the Maze Runner when I was in middle school. I remember going to the library and literally fighting with a guy in my grade because he kept renewing his copy that he was on, and it was the next book that I needed to read. I really want to reread it now that I'm an adult and I don't know, just relive those feelings. The next book that is one of my top favorites from this year is actually a local Minnesota author. Not necessarily local, she's definitely huge. You know who I'm talking about, Abby Jimenez. I read Just for the Summer. It is a romance that takes place on Lake Minnetonka, and it is genuinely the epitome of like acts of service. If he wanted to, he would. Our two main characters have this sort of curse in their dating lives where they'll date someone and then that person ends up finding the love of their life after those two break up. And so in order to cancel out this little curse, they decide to date each other, and I just thought it was brilliant. It was so fun. It was such an easy read. Love that book. Definitely gonna read more from her in the new year. And then going into another release from the romance genre from a staple everyone loves them author, Funny Story by Emily Henry was such an amazing read. Again, another romance. It is about two characters, Miles and I forget the girl's name. They actually just both got broken up with because their exes ended up dating each other. So they move in together because they have nowhere else to go. And it is a like kind of slow romance, but it's funny. Everyone I think says Miles is like Nick from New Girl or Schmidt. I don't know, I've never seen New Girl, but I just loved his character. He felt so real and just relatable. So I really loved that book this year. Now, this next book, I don't really remember anything of the plot, but I remember loving this story. This year, I read a book called 800 Grapes by Laura Dave. Genuinely, I don't really remember anything about the book except for that it is a literary fiction. It is a story of a family. It takes place on a vineyard, and if I'm remembering correctly, the one girl like ran away from her wedding, and that's kind of all I remember. But it's just this beautiful coming of age, growing up, seeing your family members in like a different light as they're now adults. I loved the book. I think I read it on Kindle Unlimited, so if it's still on Kindle Unlimited, 100% would recommend. Definitely if you're into literary fiction, to check that one out. I didn't mean to put all of the romances at the same time, but in the list, they're literally back to back. The next book is another romance release, again, from another loved BookTube book talk author, but I feel like she's a little bit of a hit or miss. This is Carly Fortune's This Summer Will Be Different. Don't really remember what this book was about, but I remember reading it and loving it. It just felt like the perfect book to read in summer. She also, I think, has a new book coming out in 2025 that I'm kind of keeping my eye on. All I remember about that book is that it takes place on Prince Edward Island, if I'm remembering correctly, and it's best friend's brother. Another romance book, I adored this book. This is The Bodyguard by Catherine Senner. This book had me giggling, kicking my feet, and I never do that when I read books, but I loved this book so much. So The Bodyguard is about our main character, who the girl is the bodyguard, and the guy is actually like a famous, I think he's an actor or something, and he had a controversy come out, so he decided to step back from the spotlight. But his mom is going through something, so he decides to step back into the spotlight to be there for his family, and so she is hired as the bodyguard, but he doesn't want his family to know that he even has a bodyguard, so they're fake dating. It was so good. If I'm remembering, the book takes place in Texas too, so yeah, I loved that book. I thought it was amazing. I know I'm really late to reading that book. I think everyone and their mom has already read it, but it was so good. If you've not already picked that book up, definitely do so. We're just gonna keep doing some romances. I read The Love of My Afterlife by Kirsty Greenwood. I loved this book because it is exactly what I thought it was going to be, but it also had a little bit of like a flip at the end of the book that, you know, kept you on your toes. The Love of My Afterlife is about our main character who ends up dying, and she meets the love of her life in the afterlife waiting room. She ends up striking up a deal with the person in the like afterlife lobby to basically send her back down to earth, and she has, I think it's like a week to get this person to kiss her on their own free will, and if she can't do it, she's got to go back. It's just funny, cute, and yeah, if you need like a good palate cleanser or just like a light-hearted fun book, I definitely would recommend that. So I read that book this past fall, and then I also read A Novel Love Story. I believe these books came out around the same time, or I think I read them around the same time. But A Novel Love Story is about our main character, who she has like her favorite romance series, and she ends up basically driving into a town which she slowly finds out is the town that that book series is based off of. Not only living in this town, but she's with these characters from this book series that she loves. I thought it was really cute. I actually really liked it. I know it was very hit or miss, but I enjoyed it, and I would recommend it more so in the fall time. It gave me very like Gilmore Girls vibes. Finally, getting out of the romance books that I read this year, I read The Reappearance of Rachel Price. This is a YA mystery thriller. It is by the author Holly Jackson, who is also the author that wrote the Good Girls Guide to Murder series. I have read, I think, all of Holly Jackson's books. If not, I've probably only missed like a book or two, and I think that this is her best book that she has ever written. The Reappearance of Rachel Price is about this family. Our main character is the daughter of Rachel Price, who is a woman who went missing, and it's this sort of like true crime, infamous case. No one knows what happened to her. And so the family decides to do a tell-all story, a sort of documentary. While they are filming the documentary, Rachel Price ends up coming back. When I tell you, you're not going to guess the ending of this book, I genuinely was surprised. This is her best book that she's ever written. If you love mystery and thrillers, you need to read this book. It was so good. Even for being a YA mystery, some of the things that were happening in the book, I was like, damn, she is really teetering, trying to cross the lines here. I feel like this book is really random to have been in my like top 24 favorite books of the year, but genuinely I had such a great time reading it, and that is Powerful by Lauren Roberts. This is the little novella in the Powerless series, and I have to be honest, I loved this book so much. It was so fun to read. It is about, I believe in the first book, like in the main series, it's Peyton and Kai. It's the girls' best friend in this book. We follow her as her bestie is in the like trials or whatever. Can I be so honest? I don't remember what happens in the main book, and I'm not going to continue on with the series. I bought this book and it was on my physical TBR, and I was like, I'm going to need to read it. Let me just read it to get it off my physical TBR. And then I ended up really liking it. This next book is another romance that I'll never stop talking about this series on my channel. This is At Last Sight by Julie Johnson. This is the Witch City series, which I've been raving and ranting about how much I love this series for genuinely so many videos on my channel already. This series is kind of like an interconnected standalone series where each book, obviously it's about a different character, different relationship, but they all are kind of the same, like damsel in distress, a sort of like private investigator, protective guy figure in Salem, Massachusetts, takes place around Halloween. It's the perfect book to read in fall, but honestly, either of the books you could read any time of year. They're so atmospheric and just fun. And yeah, love those books. I love her writing. She just is like, she's one of those authors that's an auto-buy author for me, especially this series. Next is another classic that I read this year. I was very surprised that I liked this book as much as I did. I don't know necessarily why. I just didn't like the first book that I read from this author. That is George Orwell. I read Animal Farm this year and I thought it was brilliant. It is a very short book. It's obviously a classic, so sometimes they can kind of seem a little bit more daunting than they are, but this story just genuinely is about an animal farm, and it kind of follows their story and follows what happens when a democracy turns into a dictatorship. It seems a little scary when you look at it that way, but it's so easy to read. And again, going into 2025, I think it's so important to read it. Not read anything by this author, I think this would be the book to start out with. I know a lot of people prefer 1984 to Animal Farm, but I'm flipped and I like Animal Farm more. This year, I actually did a video where my sister and her at the time fiance, now my brother-in-law, her husband, they picked out my reads for a week. I think it was my sister picked for me to read this book, but I read Crazy Rich Asians. Now, before reading this book, I had obviously watched the movie. I knew what the storyline was about, but I was surprised with how much I actually really liked the story. It's literally the movie in book form, obviously, but it's so fun and like gossipy, but at the same time touches on some really important subjects. I do want to continue on with that series, but it has been a while since I read Crazy Rich Asians. I want to say I read it in like October. I'm not sure if I were to just pick up the second book, if I like would have forgotten too much. So I might have to reread that and then pick up the rest of the series. Honestly, I forgot that I read this book this year, but I read Belladonna by Adeline Grace. I really liked this book, but there's one specific plot line in this book that I really don't like. So Belladonna is about our main character. It's a YA fantasy romantasy series, and our main character, Death, basically follows her around, and Death is kind of like a voice in her head. And so she's continuously being dropped off at new family members because her other family members keep dying. She kind of ends up sparking a sort of friendship, weird relationship with Death as a character, which I didn't love that part of the story, but it's a very like gothic and kind of dark feeling story that I really enjoyed. And I don't remember much about the story. Like, it's not one of those books that's gonna stay in my brain forever, but I do just remember really liking the book when I read it. I actually have quite a lot of classics on this list, which I did not realize, but I don't know, maybe my reading tastes are changing and I'm starting to prefer them and literary fictions. I say is literally like 60% of this list was just romances. The next book on my list of my top 24 of this year was actually The Handmaid's Tale. Again, a very difficult read, but a very important read, especially going into 2025. I don't need to explain what this book is about. You know it, and if you don't, I would recommend looking it up. Very important commentary, and I'm glad that I can say that I finally read it because I understand what it actually is versus just knowing what the storyline is and not fully having the impact of reading it. This next book is kind of, I want to say, like a historical, little bit retelling, more so educational book, and this is Divine Might by Natalie Haynes. This is a story that talks about the Greek goddesses. It's not necessarily like a fiction, you're following the characters and there's an actual storyline, but it's just genuinely almost like a textbook. I really enjoyed it. I love learning about the Greek gods. I think, you know, everyone always talks about like you were a Greek mythology kid or an Egyptian mythology kid. I was an Egyptian mythology kid, but I'm a Greek mythology adult. But yeah, also if you guys have any recommendations for books, either like educational stories about Egyptian mythology, or if there are sort of, I have the book Atlanta, there was Hera, all of those sort of stories that are more fiction retellings of those stories. If there are any for Egyptian mythology stories, I would love to read some. So if you have any recommendations, please let me know. I forgot that I read this book this year, but the next book on this list, we only have 3 more to talk about. I read Dear Dolly this year and I really enjoyed it. I love Dolly Alderton. It feels like reading like your bestie's journal. Dear Dolly is basically all of her, I think she was like a magazine slash like blog writer, and so she had these advice columns. People would ask for advice and she would just give stories and tips. I think if you're a young teenage girl in her 20s, that you would really enjoy this book. I know this book and then Everything I Know About Love, or Everything I Learn About Love. I don't remember what that one is called. I read both of them. I think I liked this one better than the other one. I forgot that I read that. I think I read that in like January or something. These next 2 books I also read very early in the year. First is A Psalm for the Wild West Built. Now I got this recommendation from Allison Pages. I miss her so much. She used to make YouTube videos. I think she's kind of taking a step back for, you know, health related reasons. She was just like one of those YouTubers and booktubers that felt so welcoming and just like a best friend. And I actually got this book recommendation from one of her videos. This story follows a society where humans and robots, they don't live together. Basically humans used and abused robots, and so one day they went away in the woods and they never came into contact. And this takes place like hundreds and hundreds of years later, where robots are kind of like a myth to humans. One day our main character comes into contact with a robot, and the robot's only question is, you know, what is the exact question? I think it's like, what is the purpose of life? Or like, what does a human need to be happy? It's something along the lines of that. These stories are very short, but they're the type of book that you read and you feel a little bit of faith in humanity. I miss Allison Pages, but I hope she's doing well. If any of you guys also watched her, let me know. Her and Noelle Gallagher were like some of my favorite booktubers, but neither of them post content anymore, and it makes me so sad. If any of you guys know booktubers that kind of have a similar comforting, just like honestly like a librarian feeling, let me know their channels in the comments. Finally, the last book in my top 24 of 2024. I listened to this on audiobook, loved this. This is a YA book, This Delicious Death, and it's such a stupid but also fun plot. In this world, there's a zombie apocalypse that happens, and they figured out a way to live with the zombies by giving them like synthetic flesh so they're not eating humans. In our main character friend group, one of the girls is this sort of like zombie, and the rest of them I believe are human. They end up going to a music festival, kind of think Coachella. They end up meeting their favorite band while they're there, but one day they wake up, their friend who's a zombie is missing, and the lead singer in this band is dead. That's so funny and stupid. I listened to it on audiobook. I think it was on Spotify at the time, or maybe I listened to it through Libby. A great book to pass time. A really like fun YA story that I feel like I have not read before. Those were my top 24 books of 2024. If you are not already, make sure that you subscribe and give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. And yeah, I'll see you in my next video.